Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I want to talk to you about Bard in Stormblood. I've been doing overview and thoughts videos for all of the jobs that I've actually leveled to 70 thus far, and Bard has been one I've been getting a lot of requests about. Now, before we get started, I'm not an expert on the job. I'm not going to tell you what the optimal rotation is. I will try to link something in the description of a resource. I had people in my chat just tell me, so I don't have like one that I used previous to this video, but I'm sure a quick Google search will yield something. So be looking in the description for that. It was my main job back in 2.0 through 2.4, so yeah, that's probably part of the reason. But I avoided it for most of 3.x, even though I did kind of enjoy it during that time. So because I'm going to be doing an overview where I go over the changes and how Bard is kind of functioning in Stormblood, as well as my thoughts, it's going to be a long video. So be sure to look in the description as well for a timestamp. I know it takes me like a minute to get through this, but now that that's out of the way, let's actually start talking about Bard in 4.0. Alright, so for the overview section of this video, we're going to talk about how Bard has changed from 2.x and even 3.x. I know a lot of people kind of abandoned the job with what happened to it in 3.x, so I feel like it's pretty important for us to cover this right from the get-go. So first of all, several skills were removed from the job. Every job kind of went through this for 4.0. Flaming Arrow, Wide Volley, Blunt Arrow, and Shadowbind were removed. Also, damage was removed from Repelling Shot, so it used to be very common to weave in Blunt Arrow and Repelling Shot as part of your rotation, just to get those off GCD damage numbers in, and that's not really there anymore. If you want to silence, we'll go into roll actions later, and Repelling Shot's just to create a gap between you and the opponent, so mostly just for dodging AoEs or getting into the right position. Now, that being said, Bard is one of the jobs that got the most changes going into 4.x, at least in my opinion. So let's cover two of the main changes to the job. The first big change is Wanderer's Minuet, which this is just part of a bigger change. It no longer gives the Bard a cast time. You can once again move freely while DPSing. This is the #1 reason why a lot of people abandoned the job, and the job was considered to be one of the most difficult to play in 3.x. So that is a big one, and I'm sure a lot of people who may or may not have known that were super excited about that when we first discovered it around time of the Media Tour. Now, Wanderer's Minuet not giving a cast time is part of a larger change. All the songs on the job were reworked to be integral parts of the Bard's rotation. For me, this was the most important change because it made good on the fantasy of a bard, a song player, whereas before it felt like an archer that just occasionally played songs as utility. Now that songs have an active role in your job, it really did wonders for the way the job feels and the way the job sort of plays out, like I said, its fantasy. So each song got a new effect to go in with this reworking. Mage's Ballad, Army's Paean, and Wanderer's Minuet are all cast on the target now and deal damage when they hit. Once you cast it on a target, a buff emanates from the Bard itself, which I've gotten a lot of questions about since it released, giving a 2% critical hit rate buff to any nearby allies. The Bard themselves does not get it, but all their nearby allies do. So if played properly, you basically have a near 100% uptime on a 2% crit buff for the party, which is incredibly valuable. Each song also gets a unique proc based on your dots critting, which is a mechanic that has been also integral to the job since 2.x with the whole Bloodletter reset factor. That is going to continue here, but it's definitely taken to another level. So when your dots crit, you have a chance of getting a proc. Ballad's proc is the old Bloodletter proc, where it makes Bloodletter and or Reign of Death reset their cooldown. Again, anyone who played it in the past few years should be very familiar with the old River of Blood mechanic from one of their traits before. Paean's proc for when your dots crit gives you a stacking buff. Each stack increases your attack speed by 4%, up to a maximum of 4 stacks, or 16% attack speed. For those who don't know, that lowers your global cooldown and your auto attack delay. Finally, we have Wanderer's Minuet, the big one that was the cause of the controversy in the first place. This one gives you stacks of Pitch Perfect, which can be spent on the ability of the same name. Pitch Perfect does more damage the more stacks you have when you use it, maxing out at 3, making that the ideal time to use it most of the time. Each of these songs lasts 30 seconds and has an 80-second cooldown, so you should be able to flow through them with little to no downtime, like I said before, pending fight mechanics. Now, those aren't the only things that sort of, again, helped Bard achieve its fantasy of being a song user. Battle Voice was reworked to be a 15% direct hit buff to the party, so long as they're affected by one of the 3 main songs when you use it. Wanderer's Pain removes a detrimental effect, same effect as before, or places a shield protecting against the debuff if the target doesn't have any to cure when you use it. Foe's Requiem is now the only song that costs MP. I didn't mention that earlier. None of those songs cost MP to maintain anymore. Foe's is the only one that does that, and it is a 3% increased damage dealt debuff when it remains active. So anybody in range takes increased damage if they're in range of foes. I will say, we'll talk about it a little bit later too, but the MP usage on foes is not very satisfying. But I'll talk about that when I go through my thoughts on the job. Troubadour grants a party-wide defensive buff that changes depending on whether you're in Ballad, Paean, or Minuet. I don't remember the effects. I think Ballad is max HP, Paean is 10% less physical damage taken, and Minuet is 10% less magic damage. I'm close, but those are the three effects. I don't remember if those are exactly what's tied to the song. And Nature's Mini, another new one, grants a healing buff to a single ally of choice, so it's almost like a targeted mantra in a sense. The old effects of Ballad and Paean are now part of role actions, which again I said we'll touch on later. As for other changes to the job, you get updated versions of Venomous Bite and Wind Bite at level 64, called Caustic Bite and Storm Bite. They hit harder and they last for 30 seconds, so you have less dot maintenance to do after you hit level 64. Straight Shot's buff was recently buffed to be 30 seconds as well, instead of the 18 seconds it used to be. Barrage can now allow for both direct hits and critical hits, so it's way stronger than it was before, and it also has an 80-second cooldown, so it actually matches the cooldown of your songs, which plays a role into your rotation when you start practicing that later on. And finally, they got Refulgent Arrow, which is just a new use for your Straighter Shot procs when you get to level 70. Basically, you use Refulgent Arrow to expend a Straighter Shot proc when you don't want to replenish Straight Shot's buff. Like if you have 18 seconds left on Straight Shot and you get a Straighter Shot proc, you can use it on Refulgent Arrow and then just maintain Straight Shot normally. One of my favorite new traits is especially integral with their songs is at level 68 you get Enhanced Imperial Arrow. It basically forces the proc of whatever song you have active. So for Ballad, it'd automatically reset the cooldown on Bloodletter / Reign of Death. On Paean, it'd automatically give you one of those attack speed buffs, a stack of it, single stack. And on Minuet, it'd give you 1 stack of Pitch Perfect. No, Barrage Imperial Arrow doesn't proc 3 times. Most people try to use Barrage on Refulgent Arrow anyway if they can get a proc. So Barrage Imperial Arrow is kind of just if your procs aren't really paying attention to you. And finally, we get to talk about role actions. When it comes to Bard specifically, role actions are pretty generic. I mentioned earlier that a lot of them were Bard abilities that were moved over from 3.x. For example, Ballad's old MP restoring effect is now on a role action called Refresh, and Paean's is on a role action called Tactician. Like I said earlier, Foes is still the only song that drains MP, so these aren't really songs, they just provide a short party-wide MP and TP buff, respectively. They also cut your enmity in half too. I guess I forgot to mention that Quelling Strikes is gone. I haven't really thought about it in a while, but these are your replacements as well for Quelling Strikes, as opposed to the way that functioned before. Bards also do have a Silence, a Heavy, a Bind, and a Stun that they can take if necessary. Some of those come over from Machinist as well, so you should be familiar. They still have Second Wind, which they can use as a self-healing tool as a role action, and Peloton is basically Swift Song as a role action. The final one, though, is pretty good. It's called Palisade. It puts a buff on a target party member, a single one, that makes them take 20% less physical damage for 10 seconds. So it could be really strong for things like a physical tank buster or big pulls in a dungeon. So that's my overview on the changes to Bard and what it wants to accomplish in 4.x. So now I get to talk about my thoughts on the job. And you know what? As much as I like to say Bard was forced on me in 2.x, and that's why I avoided it for all of 3.x, I gotta say, this made me consider maining Bard just by my own decision, because these are, in my opinion, the best job updates and changes alongside maybe Paladin and maybe White Mage even, because White Mage, as silly as the lilies are, they've been performing incredibly well. They're my favorite from a standpoint of what a Bard is. Previously, as much as I liked Bard in 3.x, and I didn't mind that it was, you know, just primarily a DPS and less of a support, just physical range DPS got kind of thrown into that support category by the community. it felt like an archer that had songs occasionally. Minuet didn't feel like a song you were singing to get those cast times. It just felt like a buff that made you play that way, and that was all it accomplished. These changes, these songs, the way you rotate between ballad, the way that they each have their own procs, you really feel more like a bard. You still predominantly feel like an archer, but the fact that you're always providing all of these supportive things, you have the MP and the TP buff, you have this Palisade buff to act as a mini tank cooldown, you have the 2% crit buff nearly permanently, you have a 15% direct hit buff, you have the max HP buff or the physical defense or the magical defense from Troubadour, you have the healing buff from Nature's Mini. You have all of these crazy good support-ish utilities, and yet you are still first and foremost a DPS, but they have just integrated the song play into it in such a more interactive and fun way. The job gauge itself, coming from the songs, doesn't feel like it's tacked on like some of the other jobs in the expansion. It makes perfect sense, and honestly, I'd like to see them expand on it and make it a little bit better so that you could track certain other things, because you still have a bunch of buff management. You still have to watch for those straighter shot procs. You're still kind of watching your hotbars, because I don't think the visual on you getting a proc is necessarily good enough. And there's other things that they could totally integrate into that job thing. Maybe even just when you're playing Foe's Requiem, any of them could give something off. It just feels natural, and it feels well done, and it feels like the job, they sat down and said, you know what, we need an identity for this job. It can't just be the archer that plays buffs. It needs to be a bard, and it's gonna be a DPS. This game doesn't have dedicated supports, so let's do it right. And I love what they accomplished with the 4.x Bard. I never thought I'd want to play Bard again because of the way I was forced to play it from 2.0 through 2.4. As soon as I could get off of it, I took that opportunity immediately. And in 3.x, avoided it like the plague. As much as I ended up having to play Machinist for 3.4's raid tier, it still was happy not to be playing Bard, even though they were in the same role. That's how much I wanted to avoid it. But as soon as I got my hands on this at the Media Tour, I spent the most time on it at the Media Tour. I've now finally leveled it to 70, even though it's on an alternate character, which I'll probably put in text at the top of the screen. It just feels so right. It feels like they made me busy. They made up for the fact that I no longer have cast times by keeping me so busy. And it just feels satisfying. When you get the procs, it's good. When you use the songs, it's good. Everything just feels right about this job. The only thing I think doesn't feel right is Foe's Requiem. It lasts like 10 to 12 seconds for a 3% buff. Here's the thing though, they have so many other buffs they offer, I can understand why. You know, it's not like Machinist where they have Hypercharge and they have like Dismantle, and that's like it. That's all they have. We have all these other buffs that are just constantly up or being rotated between. So I can understand why it doesn't last that long. It just doesn't feel good as the Bard to play foes, or doesn't feel good enough unless you're in an AoE situation that's hitting a bunch of targets. Still a DPS increase, but for me, if that can be the least satisfying thing about the job, they've done a phenomenal job at retooling Bard here. So if you're someone who stopped playing the job in 3.x, or you're someone who's never played it and never really shown interest in it, but these changes are kind of piquing your interest, I personally would make the recommendation to dive in and try the job, because I don't think, outside of Paladin and, like I said, maybe White Mage, that they did a better job on anything else. Even the new jobs, to me, don't feel as well done as Bard does, and for me, that's saying a lot. But anyway, those are my overview and thoughts on Bard. Thank you so much for watching this video. I also want to thank my Patreon supporters, which we've started doing because of YouTube's demonetization patterns that have been following over the last little bit of time. In fact, during this video, I'm actually doing a live recording, not a live recording, I'm recording myself behind the scenes talking about the creative process and the making of videos. If you're interested in seeing things like that, as well as other perks and benefits, be sure to check out my Patreon in the description of the video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I will see you all in the next one. And until then, take care.